also has been the specific emphasis on integrating young India with the G20 narrative. And since we are the chair, what are the out-of-box ideas that we have floated? How is the government planning to go about it? How can they be part of what you are doing?
Definitely, ma'am. So what happens is, when all of us think about G20, the first image that comes to our mind is prime ministers and presidents meeting at some fancy hotel and shaking hands or hugging each other. But fortunately for us, G20 is not just about prime ministers and presidents, but rather about a culmination of societies of all these countries. And a very important part of this are the engagement groups, which include various elements of the civil society, whether it be businesses, women, youth, space, sciences and everything. And in this, one of the most premier engagement group is Youth 20, which we are representing. And what Youth 20 would be doing is working on two priorities. One, working on short-term capacity building within the country, and two, creating a longer lasting impact that goes beyond just our presidency. So that's what we term as Y20, the India way. The three key goals that we are working on is: one, taking forward India's legacy as the mother of democracy in making our Y20 as inclusive as possible. And in fact, the Prime Minister also talks about Jan Bhagidari or People's G20. So the maximum thrust would be on involving all the youth in the country, whether it's been the rural areas, urban areas, and getting their stances on board. Second, investing in domestic capacity building, getting more youth voices, youth organizations, getting opportunities for our youth in terms of internships, collaborations. And finally, we'd be talking about creating a vision change. So a national resurgence through an international platform, so that our youth starts to think global and reaches out to international platforms.
Professor Cholia, just taking this forward now, the areas that Falit enumerated, particularly taking India's legacy forward, making G20 presidency, India's presidency, more inclusive, the question of capacity building and the vision change. Why is there a specific emphasis or so much of impetus put on the younger generation?
Sakal, we say that the G20 represents 2/3 of humanity, right? That's about 66% of the world's population. That's a humongous figure. But within that, when you break it down, it's the majority are young people. And the majority of this 2/3 of humanity are young people. And often their interests, their preferences, their aspirations, their fears, their anxieties have not been addressed by global institutions. They often get bypassed, meaning that, well, they are the future generations and we don't have to worry about them. They will, right now, the focus usually has been on older sections of the humanity. But now I think increasingly with the demographic surge, G20 realizes that the youth are the centerpiece. Without them, there's no future, right?
Are we making youth really a centerpiece in this particular summit under India's presidency? Like, what's the backstory?
It's a major priority.
In the previous editions?
It's a major priority. Well, the outreach groups have existed for a while. There is a Y20 even before the Indian presidency. But what we are now doing is making it more structured, deeper, and what Falit was talking about is the degree of engagement with young people and to hear out their voices in India and also in the remaining 18 member countries apart from India and the EU. That makes up the 20 countries. So that's a large youth population. They have actually gone through a lot. They've come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of them, college students, for example, are looking at the job market. There's a global economic recession being predicted for 2023-24. So huge challenges for their futures, right? And whenever, even on climate, on all the major issues of G20, the future of young people is at stake and their interests have to be prioritized and brought to the fore. I think Prime Minister has been very clear that the power of the youth must be harnessed
for global good and global change. So through dialogues, through consultation, through deep engagement with young people, we are going to try and bring their voices to the fore, so much so that the future generation, the so-called future generations, their future is secured. Otherwise, G20 has no relevance 5 or 10 or 20 years down the line.
That was my next question, making youth relevant to the whole G20 apparatus. And I think it makes a lot of sense, Falit, that we being the youngest democracy and the way we are integrating. what are the procedures? What are the processes? What kind of connect engagements you're floating, Y20 apparatus? How can they be directly associated with, I think there are some university connect, school connect programs, and it's going to be an year-long process. How do they go about it?
Definitely, ma'am. I'd start by focusing on one particular aspect as to what happened on 1st of December when we assumed the G20 presidency. It started with a lecture on G20 University Connect, in which students from 75 plus universities were connected, in which the External Affairs Minister, the G20 Sherpa and the G20 Chief Coordinator assembled, and that was a day-long event. And that's how India started its G20 presidency, which gives a very clear message as to where our focus and priorities lie. So what we'll be working on is essentially through the G20 University Connect, reaching out to all the top universities and getting the students on board. Third, we are dividing
how do you get, let's take it one by one.
Sure, ma'am.
So how do you reach out and how do you get students on board?
Sure, ma'am. So the first part of G20 University Connect is that we reach out to universities, tie up with them and plan events over these universities.
Okay. So
exactly.
events.
So in which we'd be having G20 lectures, and not just lectures. So our format is we have lectures, and post that we have breakout rooms in which the students are separated into different groups and they have group discussions over our themes and priority areas. They give forth their suggestions, which are then accumulated and assembled, and then they are submitted to the ministries and the engagement groups for further consideration. And in fact, a lot of those priorities that we have right now have come out from the engagements that we did last year. In fact, last year we were at the Jindal campus itself and having a discussion, and a lot of those priorities that we are assembling are then going on into these documents. Second, students would be part of all of these events. They would be working as escorts to these delegations. So they would be the one in contact with all the delegations for all the engagement groups and working group, coordinating how they're coming, whatever is going on, documenting the entire process and culminating in all of these processes. And third, all the engagement groups would be having interns who would be working in creating documents, creating resources, making all of this public facing through writing articles, getting all of this in the domain. And finally, in all of these aspects, these different engagement groups would also be tying up with universities as knowledge partners. So we ourselves as U20 have 20 prospective knowledge partners, different universities, where the student body would be creating documents and setting up the agendas and the white papers.
Okay.
So it is a national exercise.
National exercise, and I think this, Professor Sriram, this is going international also, because in the recent Bali summit, UK-India Young Professional Scheme has also been announced, which means around annually 3,000 degree holders, Indians from the age group of 18 to 30 can go to UK under this program and vice versa. Are we looking at more such programs? But how does this help?
So yeah, there are a lot of mobility schemes
Yes.
that you're talking about. One of which you just explained. What this does is, you need a meeting of minds. You need consensus building, right? It's not only at the elite top level, at the level of society and civil society. And youth are the most vibrant element in the civil society. So the idea is that if a young person from India sits down with a young person from Brazil and with a young person from let's say Germany and with a young person from one other EU country or somebody from North America, then and one from Africa, let's say, then you have a free flow of ideas as to what is common among all of us, no matter which culture and region we belong to, and how we can share we have some shared concerns, and those need to be relayed to the top level. What Falit is talking about, the processes are meant to like a churning, where ideas come out and then they are transferred to the higher level policy making unit, so that there is a kind of accountability of the global institutions to the youth of the world. That is the whole idea. It's a kind of accountability mechanism we are creating, so that they don't feel disenfranchised, so that the young feel that they are recognized and that they are not being sidelined. It's a question of what we call intergenerational justice. The older generations, we have exploited the climate, we have exploited the earth, we have made it such a horrible place.
Earlier?
It was missing. So I think we are going to bring this in. This is going to be an important focus area. Our Minister for Youth and Sports, Anurag Thakurji, has also been saying that we have to put the youth at the center of our G20 presidency, and that's the goal.
So basically putting youth in the center stage, at the center stage of the entire G20 big picture. And India here is, I think I can safely say, taking the pole position or the leadership position, especially in the context of Y20. Falit, since you're the India's ambassador, of the Y20 system. This is going to be a year-long exercise, and you're interacting. You already started these programs and interactions with the delegates from other nations like you. But just explain to our viewers, what's the sense you're getting from the top? What's the vision of the government of India for you guys in the G20 perspective?
Sure, ma'am. Before I begin answering that, I'd just point out one thing. So you talked about the transaction and the mobility, academic mobility. Now this is one factor. So the Bali summit happened in November. Our summit Y20 happened in July, and this particular proposal to push forward academic mobility and interaction between governments, this was put forward by India's U20 delegation last year, and we were able to successfully get it in the Y20 communique.
So one of the important deliverables. Huh?
Yeah, so if you read out the Y20 communique, it is mentioned very specifically. And not just that, we also talk about that the visa facilitation should happen very quickly, because a lot of times these schemes, people get stuck because visa processes are slow. So we have given a very actionable roadmap that we gave in July, and all these aspects that are coming out is out of the pressure that we are building and demands that we are putting forth.
So youth putting forth, Professor Chaulia, actionable points, and Y20 can be a big pressure group. Can I say that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, like I said, a constituency, an important one, and one that is, knocking on the doors of the global institutions, because global institutions, multilateral institutions are in crisis, because average people on the ground who are powerless and who are weak and who are yet to become influential find that their voices have not been heard and their interests are often being disregarded. So I think the youth have to come in, and that's what we are trying to do through the process. It's a kind of a bridging the gap between, like I said, the society, civil society, and the global order.
Okay, now let's quickly have some points coming from my young friends here. Yes, can you please pass on the mic?
What is the impact of academic mobility on the newly found emphasis on interdependence in international relations, and how can academic mobility, especially across nations, affect interdependence on a global scale?
So essentially, when we look at countries and our relations with them, I mean, there are countries with whom we have friendly relations, countries with whom we don't have such friendly relations, and then there are neutral countries. And essentially, in dealing with all of those, what we need is people who understand those cultures. So what we have been significantly lacking in India is that students who are, for international relations or so, prior to that we didn't even have bachelors in those. Now institutions like Jindal are coming up in that domain. But what we also specifically need is these students to be engraved in those cultures that they are studying.
So the intermobility under the Y20 or the Youth 20 banner is also going to acclimatize both sides with the systems that we follow in various ministries, verticals of Government of India, and most importantly, that shared vision that we've been talking about. I think we have one more question. Can you please pass the mic and he can ask the question?
So do you think countries like India, Australia, those are developing countries, are they suffering due to these decisions, or the unity of G20 is declining?
There is a problem of lack of consensus, and a lot of groups and subgroups are formed within the G20, and India's big effort is to try and build bridges and to unite around a consensus. That's been the biggest problem for us, and I think that's the ultimate challenge. At the level of young people, maybe you can all get along. Suppose you are talking to G20 counterparts through the Y20 mechanism, it may be easier, but when you have nation states, then you have a different competitive logic and geopolitical rivalries and all those, right? So how to manage those in such a way it does not lead to war, one, and two, in a way that we have common minimum denominator of agreement on what kind of policies we should all adopt together. Policy coordination is the key for G20. Right now you are right, energy is one area, but there are so many areas on which there is no consensus, and sometimes a lot of bickering, no joint declarations, no communiques. The G20 is struggling. That's why there's so much onus on India and our presidency. And I can tell you that at the level of young people through Y20, you should try and come up with shared visions that at least remind the elites that it's time to keep aside the bilateral narrow conflicts and rivalries and think big, think about the planet as a whole, because all our joint futures are at stake. So It is to create that sense of a collective existence and coexistence. That's what we need more. Right now we are struggling, and that's why we hope that India's leadership will change things.
Yes, so under the India's leadership, Professor Cholya, there is a possibility that you can have a single page where India can get the rest of the 19 nations plus others on the same page. I mean, it's not possible for every country to look eye to eye on everything. But my question here is, before I take one more question from the students here, that long-lasting impact, world is looking at India. Are we looking at a very different sort of paradigm shift, that this G20 under India's presidency is not going to be seen as a posh affair, but as a people-centric affair? And that's why we are integrating youngsters into this entire process, which many would say that it's more diplomatics between the heads of the state. And what have students got to do with it?
Yeah, so that's what we call multi-stakeholder multilateralism, to bring in more stakeholders from society, especially young people, from academia, from education sector. And you see, India is uniquely positioned because we have kept our lines open. We are not into these Cold War type, breaking up of the world into different blocks, and we, based on our national interests, have channels with all sides. Let's say on the Russia-Ukraine war, that's just one example which is dividing the world right now. So I think our young people also, because we come from a democracy, vibrant mother of democracy, as Honorable Prime Minister calls it, we've got that in our genes, right? Our ability to have what we call samvad, dialogue, and this is much more than just a formality. It's something that is deeper, out of which you get something. वो सागर मंथन कहते हैं ना, उसके अंदर से निकलता है something. The outcome of it is something that can give us direction for the future.
And here is our future. Yes, go ahead with your question.
Technically now, I want to know on the level of G20, how much of the work has been done when it comes to like women-based research and also promoting women, because democracy technically means bringing about equity as well.
Yes.
And I strive for equity more than equality.
Yes. So women leading the way, I think this is also one of our cornerstones, Falit.
Yeah, definitely, ma'am. So essentially,
no, but are we doing really something about it?
Definitely.
It's just it's on paper.
No, ma'am. So things are actually moving on ground. That is the point that I want to raise. So just like U20, there is another engagement group called Women 20, which is very, very pointedly and specifically working on this domain.
Okay, so we have Women 20 also.
Yes. There's Women 20. And now what is also interesting is similarly we have Startup 20. And what we are doing right now is working on inter-engagement group events and planning, so that what we deliver is on those lines that it also affects those particular segments. So Women 20, in fact, while you're coming, today only we'll be having a meeting with the Women 20 team, and we're also having a meeting with the Startup 20 team, so that how can we build forth plans that are basically serving the segment which is youth, women, and for entrepreneurs, or similarly for youth, women, and sciences. So these all different domains are interacting with each other to bring out something that would transcend just our presidencies. We are trying to create capacities.
So you have overlapping agendas.
Exactly,
So basically G20 doesn't really confine to G20 per se. It has Youth 20 and Youth 20, if I'm not wrong, it further branches into various verticals where you have startups, women-led development, education, science, etc. being discussed threadbare. And there's going to be an exchange of thoughts with the other G20 nations under those templates, right? Okay, one more question.
India's G20 presidency was highly successful. What would this imply? How will success for India's presidency be measured, and what would be the matrix and indicators?
Professor Cholya.
Every host country thinks that it has done a great G20, and they always say that it's a landmark. But I think Prime Minister is very serious about wanting to touch the chords as far as the core issues are concerned. So that's why we are now our priorities have been designed in such a way that they address the interests of the greatest good of the greatest number of people.
Under India's chair, we are attaching tremendous amount of significance to younger generation, and we are making them one of the most critical and pivotal stakeholders in the entire G20, ecosystem or G20 big picture. Professor Cholya, very quickly.
Yeah, you know,
I mean, what I'm trying to ask is that this is something unprecedented that any other country might not have really done it in the past, where their role was just confined to those conferences and summits and yearly affairs, and then everything is forgotten.
see, it helps, like I said, because India is a democratic country. I mean, imagine if China was hosting G20. I mean, they would not have this kind of depth of free expression and exchange of ideas and criticism and debate, right? So it is our thing, and I don't think there's any bigger democracy than India in the G20, right? So we have that, inbuilt, that it's, as I said, it's in our DNA, and therefore I think the onus is on us to set the standard so that all future G20 presidencies will then take over from us and say, wow, the Indians did such an extraordinary job that we've got to really live up to that standard.
So Falit and rest of you already have a role cut out for you for the next year, and it doesn't stop there. I think the work, it's going to be work under progress. I'm going to have one last question.
How do you define the position of New Delhi as a new center of opportunities in the Indo-Pacific, specifically in the terms of maritime security and free trade routes?
The G20 is universal. First of all, it's not based on one specific sub-region. It doesn't address only the Indo-Pacific. But I would say that what we are trying to achieve is some kind of a pause to the growing tensions that you are seeing around the world, the so-called Cold Wars, which are leading to a lot of militarization, insecurity, and even wars, as we are seeing. So I think that is something. Prime Minister Modi's phrase that this is not the era of war has been enshrined in the Bali communique of the last Indonesian G20 presidency. So everybody agrees that this should not be the era of war. But what we can do to actually concretely stop these wars is going to be very central, as I said. So, and some of these include high tensions in the Indo-Pacific, like the potential invasion of Taiwan. I mean, that's something that could lead to World War III potentially. So I think we need to, the G20 has to take on the responsibility, because the UN system is kind of become fossilized. The UN Security Council has not been reformed. We, for example, don't even have a permanent seat in the UN yet, even though we are the most deserving candidate. So we are placing more hopes now in the G20, where we have full membership, where we have now leadership, where we have a higher stature. And this is the platform through which I think global peace and security also has to be addressed, and it affects all of you, because like I said, it's not only economics. Peace and security is also fundamental for your futures, because the two are intertwined, right? So your futures, your personal safety, your physical security, and also the job opportunities that all of you are looking out for after finishing college, a lot of it depends on the success of the G20 mechanism. And so that's why it's not so much about what do you all want from the G20, it's about what can you all give to the G20, because it's, if the G20 succeeds, we all live well and
so if
and
G20
better.
succeeds, we all which it will, I'm sure, the way we are going about it. But Y20 or Youth 20, an integral cornerstone of G20 under India's presidency as the agent of change, the change makers. Is Y20, U20 going to be a big factor, rather one of the decisive factors when it comes to the change makers, youngsters taking the lead? I'm going to quickly come to you both. Again, 30 seconds, final remarks.
Sure. So I'm really happy with
was all raring to go for this question.
So I'm really happy with the way the discussion has went and gone forward. The very most important aspect with respect to awareness is, because we have the presidency, we are having these kinds of discussions, and we are reaching out to a lot of different schools. Also, we are having these discussions, sending speakers. They are interacting with the the students, and this is heralding a mindset change. And this is what I said. It is an opportunity for us to have national resurgence through this international platform. And if G20 presidency would not have been there, all of these things would not have been there. That is also something which is clearly given. So we have to make the most of this opportunity and also bring out tangible changes and tie-ups with all those international bodies, so that it continues and have a lasting impact beyond just this presidency.
Excellent. Professor Cholia, final word.
Yeah, you know, we say that it's India's time to lead, and definitely it's a lot of emphasis on our leadership, but I would say it's also the youth's time to lead. And through the Y20 mechanism, we are now able to mobilize young people much more, as Falit is saying, across the country. In schools and colleges, people are all talking about the G20. There are like mock G20 competitions being conducted. Earlier we only had model United Nations events, but now there are model G20 events also being conducted. So I think the spirit of G20 has come in, and we are really showing how India as a society is fully endowed in this idea of taking the G20 forward. We have really taken ownership of this responsibility and are going forward, and all of the young people here believe in this.
So it's India, like pointed out by Professor Cholia, they're taking the ownership responsibility and handing over this very responsibility to these change makers, the young India, the Y20, the Youth 20 under G20 banner. Not only change makers, the work is under progress. They're going to be, as rightly pointed out by a young Y20 ambassador of India, Falit Sajaria, taking this national resurgence to the international platform. That is precisely when we say that India leads the way, the India way. On that note, thank you very much, Professor Cholia, for joining us and sharing insights. And also many thanks, Falit Sajaria, for also talking to us on this particular edition of DD Dialogue. And thank you, all of you, for participating. And this is going to continue, by the way, viewers. I'm going to wrap it up here. But in the next episode, we are going to talk about the specific agendas. The specific agendas when it comes to Youth 20 scripting a fresh template, where it's once again going to be not India only leading the way, but all these changes the India way. Namaskar.